I had always been a night owl. It was something I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Working late, catching up on shows, and scrolling through social media while the rest of the world slept. But that particular night, I had a nagging feeling I should go to bed early. I ignored it. My apartment was small but cozy, nestled in a quiet neighborhood that had always felt safe. The walls were adorned with photos of friends and family, and the soft glow of fairy lights created a warm ambiance. I spent the evening binge-watching my favorite true crime series, my laptop propped on my lap, and a bowl of popcorn balanced precariously on the arm of my couch. Around 1 a.m. I heard a noise outside. At first, I brushed it off as the usual sounds of the city, the distant hum of cars, or maybe the occasional bark of a dog. But then I heard it again, a soft rustling, followed by what sounded like footsteps. I paused the show and leaned forward, straining to listen. The footsteps seemed to be getting closer. I glanced at the window, but the curtains were drawn tight. I hesitated for a moment, the nagging feeling returning, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I had never had any issues in this neighborhood. Deciding to push through my anxiety, I turned the volume back up on my show, but the footsteps continued, echoing softly in the quiet night. My heart began to race, and I shifted uncomfortably on the couch, feeling the weight of unease settle over me. After a few minutes, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stood up and tiptoed over to the window, pulling the curtains aside just a fraction to peek outside. The street was dark, illuminated only by the flickering glow of the street lamp. Everything looked normal, yet that feeling of unease lingered like a shadow. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just someone out for a late-night walk. But as I turned to head back to the couch, a figure caught my eye, someone standing at the end of the street. It was a man. He was tall, his features obscured by the darkness, but I could see he was just standing there, staring directly at my apartment. My stomach twisted into knots as I realized he was looking right at me. The streetlight didn't reach him, casting him in a shadow that felt unnaturally deep. I quickly closed the curtains and stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just a passerby, or perhaps he was waiting for someone. But the way he stood there, unmoving, felt off. For the next hour, I tried to distract myself with my show, but my mind kept wandering back to the man. Every sound outside sent me into a panic, and I found myself glancing at the window more often than I wanted to admit. I considered calling a friend or even the police, but what would I say? I saw a guy standing outside my apartment for a few minutes. It felt silly. Finally, exhaustion got the better of me, and I crawled into bed, hoping that sleep would come and wash away the tension of the night. I buried my head under the covers, trying to ignore the anxiety creeping into my thoughts. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I lay there, wide awake, every little noise amplifying in the silence. Then I heard it again, a soft knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, straining to hear the sound of my heartbeat. Another knock, this one louder. I sat up terrified. My mind raced as I thought of what to do. Maybe it was a neighbor? I didn't have many, but I was sure I hadn't upset anyone. Then came the voice, deep and gravelly. "I know you're in there." My heart dropped. I didn't recognize the voice, and instinct kicked in. I reached for my phone, gripping it tightly as I slid out of bed, moving silently toward the door. I had to see who it was without opening the door. I peeked through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. I could feel my breath quickening, panic rising in my chest. "Who are you?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Just let me in. We need to talk." Something was unsettling in the way he spoke, like he knew me, but I had no idea who he was. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I considered calling the police, but then I remembered it was late, and I didn't want to be that person overreacting. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that wrapped around me like a thick blanket. I moved back to my bed, my heart still pounding, and tried to calm down. I could hear the clock ticking in the background, a constant reminder of the tension in the air. Eventually, I fell into a fitful sleep, only to be jolted awake by the sound of my phone buzzing. Groggy and disoriented, I grabbed it from my nightstand and squinted at the screen. It was a message from my friend Sarah, checking in to see if I wanted to hang out. I texted her back, letting her know I was too tired. As I put my phone down, I felt a surge of anxiety again. Had the man returned? I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see him lurking outside, but the street was empty. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Instead, I locked the door and turned on the TV for some background noise, hoping it would ease my nerves. The flickering light was comforting, and after a while, I settled back into bed, forcing myself to relax. The next morning, the sun filtered through my curtains, bathing the room in warm light. I felt ridiculous about the night before and decided I would simply forget it. I went about my day, catching up on errands and work, but the nagging feeling lingered in the back of my mind. As the sun set and darkness crept in again, I felt a shiver of unease wash over me. I locked the doors and settled onto the couch, determined to distract myself with a movie. But halfway through, I heard it again, the soft rustling outside. My heart raced as I peered through the window again. This time, the street was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the anxiety grew as the night wore on. Just as I was about to shut everything down for the night, my phone buzzed again. I looked down to see a message from an unknown number. "I see you." I froze, my heart racing. Who was this? I glanced around my apartment, suddenly feeling incredibly vulnerable. I typed a quick response, asking who it was, but I didn't receive an answer. I sat there, staring at the screen, waiting for a response that never came. Panic surged through me as I bolted to the window, peering out into the darkness. That's when I saw him again, the man from before, standing at the edge of the street, just out of reach of the streetlight. I could barely make out his features, but the way he stood there, unmoving, sent chills down my spine. I felt the urge to run to the phone and call the police, but I was paralyzed with fear. Instead, I grabbed my laptop and tried to look up the number that had messaged me, but it was blocked. My stomach twisted as I realized that the number was untraceable. I dialed 911, my hands shaking as I waited for someone to pick me up. 911, what's your emergency? I think someone is watching me, I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. There's a man outside my apartment. Can you describe the man? I glanced outside again, but he was gone. He was just standing there. I don't know how to explain it. He just looks wrong. Stay on the line, and I'll dispatch an officer to your location. I hung up, heart pounding. I felt trapped in my apartment. I tried to distract myself with anything, a movie, scrolling through my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over me like a storm cloud. The minutes dragged on, every tick of the clock echoing in the silence. Then suddenly, there was a loud bang against my door. I jumped, my heart racing as I glanced toward the sound. "Open up!" a gruff voice shouted from the other side. "It's the police!" Relief washed over me as I rushed to the door, flinging it open. Two officers stood there, their faces serious but concerned. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, stepping inside. "We got a call about someone watching you." "I don't know who he is," I said, panic bubbling over. "He's been standing outside my apartment." The officers exchanged glances, and then one of them turned back to me. "Can you describe him?" Before I could answer, I glanced out the window. There he was again, standing across the street, illuminated by the flashing lights of the police car. "There! He's right there!" I exclaimed, pointing. The officers turned, eyes narrowing as they followed my gaze. But when they looked back, the man was gone. I felt my heart sink. "Are you sure it was him?" the officer asked, concern in his voice. "Yes, he was just there." "Okay, let's take a look around," the officer said, motioning for his partner to follow. They stepped outside, leaving me in the doorway, my heart racing. I watched as they searched the area, looking behind cars and in shadows, but they didn't find anything. After a few minutes, they returned, shaking their heads. "We didn't see anyone," one of the officers said. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I felt my stomach drop. "Yes, I swear he was there." "Okay, well, we can patrol the area tonight," the officer said. "But if you feel unsafe, it might be a good idea to stay with a friend." I nodded, but inside I felt completely alone. The officers left, and I closed the door, locking it behind me. The weight of unease settled over me again, but I tried to shake it off. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every noise and struggling to sleep. Finally, the sun began to rise, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe everything would feel better in the light of day. I got dressed and decided to head to work early. As I left the apartment, I glanced around the parking lot, but everything seemed quiet. I made my way to my car, but as I opened the door, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It was a note, folded neatly and tucked under my windshield wiper. My hands trembled as I reached for it, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the neat handwriting. "I know you're scared. Just wait, I'll be watching," My heart dropped as the words sunk in. I looked around, panic rising again. I could feel the walls closing in on me as I rushed into my car and locked the doors, feeling the need to escape. I decided to drive to work instead of staying at home. The morning commute was a blur, my mind racing as I replayed everything that had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. When I got to the office, I tried to focus, but I felt like I was in a fog. I couldn't concentrate on anything, and every time someone walked by my desk, I jumped. My coworkers noticed my unease, but I brushed off their concerns. Finally, at lunchtime, I stepped outside for some fresh air. I walked around the block, trying to shake off the anxiety that clung to me. That's when I saw him again, standing across the street, watching me. My heart raced as I turned to run back inside. I felt his eyes on me, piercing through the crowd, and I could barely breathe as I hurried through the door, slamming it shut behind me. That night, I knew I couldn't go home. I called Sarah and asked if I could crash at her place. "Of course, come over," she said, sounding excited. I grabbed a few essentials and drove to her apartment, feeling a bit safer with her around. We ordered food and caught up on life, and for a moment I felt normal again. But as the sun set and darkness enveloped the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced out the window, but all I could see was the empty street below. "You okay?" Sarah asked, noticing my anxiety. "Yeah, just a long day," I replied, forcing a smile. As the night wore on, we settled into a movie, but I couldn't focus. The nagging feeling returned, and my phone buzzed. Another message: "I'm not done with you yet." Panic surged through me as I showed Sarah the message. "Who is this?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "It's just a random number." We decided to call the police again, but when they arrived, they couldn't do anything without more information. I felt helpless as they left, assuring me they would patrol the area. That night, I lay awake on Sarah's couch, every noise outside making me jump. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The next morning, Sarah had to go to work, and I reluctantly went back to my apartment. I pulled into the parking lot, scanning the area for any sign of the man. The note still haunted me, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I got out of the car. I hurried to my door, fumbling with my keys. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The sunlight poured in through the windows, but the warmth didn't reach me. I felt exposed and vulnerable. As the day wore on, I tried to distract myself by cleaning and organizing. I had to feel in control, even if everything else was spinning out. Then, just as I sat down to take a break, I heard a noise from outside. I rushed to the window, peeking out. There was a delivery truck parked nearby, but I didn't see anyone around. Just as I was about to turn away, I caught a glimpse of movement. Someone hiding behind the truck, their eyes peering up at my apartment. I gasped and stepped back, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and called the police again, trying to explain what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. After what felt like an eternity, I hung up and paced the room. I knew I couldn't stay here, not anymore. I grabbed my things and made my way back to my car, shaking as I stepped outside. That's when I saw him again, standing across the street, a twisted smile on his face. I froze, feeling paralyzed with fear as he raised his hand and waved slowly, taunting me. I scrambled into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I dialed Sarah. "You have to come get me," I said, my voice trembling. "He's here. I can't stay here." "Okay, I'm on my way," she replied, her tone serious. I waited in the car, trying to keep my eyes on the man, but he had vanished again. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, and I was the prey. When Sarah arrived, I jumped into her car, heart pounding. "What happened?" she asked, looking worried. "I don't know," I said, feeling the tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I just want this to stop." We spent the rest of the day at a nearby cafe, trying to forget about everything. I felt a bit safer with Sarah around, but the unease never fully left me. That night, I returned to my apartment, determined to take back control. I was tired of living in fear. I locked all the windows and doors, ensuring everything was secure. I settled down on the couch, promising myself I wouldn't let the man ruin my life. But as the hours passed and darkness enveloped the room, the feeling of dread returned. My phone buzzed again, but this time, I didn't want to look. I felt like I was in a horror movie, and I wanted to be the one to survive. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and opened the message. "I'm coming for you." My heart raced as I slammed the phone down, breathing heavily. I felt trapped in my own body, every instinct screaming for me to run. Just then I heard a noise, a soft scratching at the window. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, unable to move. The scratching grew louder, followed by a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Let me in." I bolted to my feet, my heart racing as I rushed toward the door. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let him in. I needed to escape. I grabbed my keys and flung the door open, darting into the hallway. But as I ran down the stairs, I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder and there he was, just steps away, a dark figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. I sprinted out of the building, my heart pounding in my ears. I ran toward my car, fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock it. But before I could get in, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned around, panic surging as I found myself face to face with him. He was closer than I had ever seen him, his eyes dark and empty, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. I screamed, shoving him away as I lunged for my car. I managed to get the door open and jumped inside, locking it just in time. I could see his reflection in the rearview mirror, still grinning as he stepped back. I turned the engine over and sped out of the parking lot, heart racing. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. As I drove away, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a wave of exhaustion. I knew I couldn't let him find me again. I drove aimlessly for hours, finally pulling into a 24-hour diner to catch my breath. I sat in a booth, trying to steady my shaking hands as I ordered a cup of coffee. The warm mug felt comforting in my grasp, but the unease lingered like a shadow. That's when my phone buzzed again. I froze, staring at the screen as the familiar number flashed across it. "I'm right behind you." I looked over my shoulder, panic flooding my senses. The diner was empty except for a few scattered customers, but I felt his presence looming over me. I quickly dropped my phone into my bag, trying to calm my breathing. As I sipped my coffee, I scanned the diner, feeling more vulnerable than ever. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, and every time the door opened, I flinched, expecting to see him walk in. After what felt like an eternity, I decided I had to leave. I couldn't stay here, waiting for him to find me. I grabbed my bag and walked to the door, trying to look as calm as possible. But just as I stepped outside, I froze. He was standing there, leaning against the wall, a sinister smile plastered on his face. "Thought you could escape me?" he taunted, stepping closer. I turned to run, but he grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "You're not going anywhere." Panic surged through me as I struggled against his grip, but he was too strong. Just then I heard a siren in the distance, growing closer. He hesitated for a moment, eyes narrowing. "This isn't over," he growled before shoving me away. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the police car pulled up. The officers stepped out, guns drawn. "What's going on here?" one of them shouted. I quickly explained, pointing to the man as he tried to back away. "He's been stalking me." The officers moved in, apprehending him as I watched, shaking with fear. The man's twisted smile faded as they cuffed him, and I felt a surge of relief wash over me. As they led him away, I realized I had finally taken back my life. I was no longer the victim, I was free. The police assured me that they would keep an eye on me and that the man would be taken into custody. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. I knew I still had a long road ahead of me, but I finally felt like I could breathe again. I had faced my fears and survived, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me again. As I drove home, the sun began to rise, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I was safe, and that was enough for me. It was late October, the air crisp with the bite of oncoming winter, and the streets were covered in a fine layer of fallen leaves. Halloween was just around the corner, and the whole town was buzzing with the usual excitement. Decorations going up, kids planning their costumes, and the occasional scarecrow or jack-o'-lantern appearing on porches. But for me, Halloween had always been more of a quiet night. My friends would throw parties or go to haunted houses, but I'd always preferred something more low-key. Until that year, it was my friend Greg who first mentioned the house. We were hanging out after class one afternoon when he brought it up. "You ever heard of the Halloween house?" he asked, his voice low like he was telling me a secret. I hadn't. I didn't grow up in the town, so there were still plenty of things I was learning about it, even after living here for a couple of years. "Nah," I said. "What's that?" Greg leaned in, his face a little too serious. "It's this old house at the edge of town, past the woods. Nobody knows who owns it, but every Halloween it just opens up. Lights go on, like someone's inside, and the door's unlocked. People say it's haunted. Some say it's cursed. I rolled my eyes. Come on, man. That's classic urban legend stuff. But Greg wasn't smiling. I'm serious. I know people who've been there. They said it's not like any haunted house you've ever seen. People who go in don't always come out. Don't come out? I laughed, trying to shake off the sudden chill running down my spine. What? Like they just disappear? Greg didn't say anything for a moment, just staring at me. Then he shrugged. Something like that. Look, you don't have to believe me. But some of the guys were talking about going out there this year. Just to see. You in? I hesitated. Normally I'd pass on something like this. But something about the way Greg was acting like there was more to the story than he was letting on made me curious. Sure, I said against my better judgment. Why not? The week passed quickly, and soon enough, it was Halloween night. Greg and a couple of others, Jake, Kyle, and Hannah, picked me up around 10 p.m. They had a cooler in the back seat and were already in full party mode, cracking jokes and blasting music as we drove out of town. The mood was light, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease growing in the pit of my stomach. The further we drove, the more isolated the road became. The houses thinned out until there was nothing but trees and darkness. The street lights disappeared, and the only light came from the full moon hanging low in the sky. Finally, Greg turned off onto a narrow dirt road, overgrown with weeds and barely visible in the headlights. There it is, Greg said quietly as the house came into view. It was old, that much was clear, but it didn't look like a typical haunted house. It wasn't falling apart. There weren't any broken windows and no creepy shutters banging in the wind. It was just ordinary, but there was something off about it. The way it sat there, alone at the end of the road, surrounded by trees that seemed to loom closer than they should. It looked too perfect, like it was waiting for us. The lights were on, just like Greg had said, casting a warm glow from the windows. The front door was slightly ajar. Creepy as hell, Kyle muttered from the back seat. We got out of the car, and the crunch of leaves underfoot seemed too loud in the stillness of the night. The air felt heavier here, like it was pressing down on us. I glanced at Greg, but he seemed focused, his usual joking attitude gone. You sure about this? I asked, trying to sound casual. Greg nodded. Yeah, just stick together, we'll be fine. We approached the front door, the wind picking up slightly, sending a few dead leaves swirling around our feet. The door creaked open with the slightest push, revealing a dark hallway lined with old portraits. The house smelled faintly of dust and something else, something metallic. I could hear the others talking behind me, their voices low and nervous. Let's just check it out and get the hell out of here, Jake said. We all agreed, none of us wanting to admit how spooked we were already. The hallway led into a large living room, sparsely furnished with old wooden chairs and a small table. Everything looked clean, like someone had been taking care of the place. But there was something wrong. It was too clean, too well maintained for a house that was supposedly abandoned. Creepy, but not exactly haunted house material, Kyle said, forcing a laugh. That's when we heard it. A soft thud, like something heavy had fallen upstairs. We all froze, looking at each other. What the hell was that? Hannah whispered. Greg shrugged, but I could see the tension on his face. Probably just the house settling. Old places like this make weird noises. Yeah, right, Jake muttered. Let's go check it out. We made our way up the staircase, the old wood creaking under our weight. As we reached the second floor, the air seemed to grow colder, and the faint smell of something rotten hit my nose. I tried to ignore it, but my stomach churned. The upstairs hallway was lined with doors, all closed. At the end of the hall, one door stood slightly open, just enough to see a sliver of darkness beyond. Let's just take a quick look and then get out of here, Greg said, his voice tight. We moved toward the open door, every step feeling heavier than the last. As we got closer, the smell grew stronger, almost overpowering. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming at me to turn around and leave. But something kept me moving forward, like I was being pulled toward the door. Greg was the first to reach it. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open with a loud creak. Inside was a bedroom, sparsely furnished like the rest of the house, but something was off. The bed was made, but the sheets were stained dark with something I didn't want to think about. And in the corner of the room, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His back was to us and he was facing the wall, his head tilted slightly to the side like he was listening for something. What the hell? Kyle whispered. Greg took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Hey man, you okay?" The figure didn't move. Greg stepped closer. "Look, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny." Suddenly, the figure twitched, its head jerking slightly. Greg froze, his hand hovering in the air. That's when the figure slowly turned to face us. My blood ran cold. His face was pale, almost gray, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to bore into me. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, but his eyes were dead, lifeless. Before any of us could react, the figure lunged at Greg with unnatural speed. He let out a strangled scream as the man grabbed him, pulling him toward the wall. The others screamed, and chaos erupted as we all scrambled for the door. I don't remember how I made it down the stairs, but I could hear Greg's screams echoing through the house as I ran. The others were right behind me, their faces pale with terror. We burst out of the front door and into the night, sprinting toward the car. We didn't stop until we were back in the car, the doors locked, the engine roaring to life. Greg's screams had stopped, and the house loomed behind us, silent and dark once more. Nobody said a word as we drove back to town, the fear hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't until we were safely back in Greg's apartment that we dared to speak. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, my mind still racing, "but we're never going back there." We never did. We didn't talk about it again and didn't tell anyone what had happened. And as far as I know, nobody else has gone back to the Halloween house since that night. I wish I could forget it, but I can still see that man's face in my nightmares, his dead, hollow eyes staring right through me. I never thought a simple road trip could lead to such a horrifying experience. My name is Ryan, and I've always had an adventurous spirit, opting for spontaneous journeys over mundane routines. It was a Friday evening when I decided to take a solo road trip to a nearby national park, which I'd heard about from friends, but never visited myself. The thrill of exploring somewhere new was too tempting to resist. As I packed my bag, I brought all the essentials: a flashlight, a first aid kit, snacks, and of course my camera. I wanted to capture the beauty of nature. The sun was beginning to set as I hit the road, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was a beautiful evening, and I felt excited as I drove along the winding roads, the sound of my favorite playlist filling the car. After a couple of hours, I arrived at the park's entrance. By then, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and darkness quickly swallowed the landscape. The park was known for its stunning views, but it also had a reputation for being isolated and eerie at night. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside, eager to start my adventure. I parked in a secluded area and grabbed my camera, stepping out into the cool night air. The forest was alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness as I ventured down a narrow trail, snapping pictures of the towering trees and moonlight filtering through the branches. Everything was quiet, a little too quiet. After a while, I reached a small clearing where I set up my tripod and began taking long exposure shots of the night sky. The stars twinkled brightly, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. But that feeling didn't last. As I adjusted my camera, I heard a faint rustling sound behind me. I turned around, my heart racing, but saw nothing, just the dark, still woods. Shrugging it off as an animal, I continued taking photos. The unease, however, lingered. Glancing at my watch, I realized it was nearly midnight. I debated heading back, but decided to stay a little longer to enjoy the solitude. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that looked like a shadow darting between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, shining my flashlight toward where I thought I'd seen the movement. Nothing, just darkness, but something felt wrong. The air was heavier and thicker, like the forest itself was watching me. Then I heard it, a whisper, so faint it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. It said my name. I froze. My pulse quickened as I scanned the woods, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But then I heard it again, louder this time. Ryan. I spun around, frantically shining the flashlight in all directions, but there was no one there. A chill crept down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I felt rooted to the spot, gripped by a sense of dread. Suddenly, the whisper became a voice, clearer and closer. "Ryan, come here." It was faint but undeniably real. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My feet moved before my mind had caught up, and I found myself backing away from the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest seemed darker, more oppressive. The path I had taken earlier seemed to stretch endlessly, and with each step I could feel something following me, though I didn't dare look back. As I walked, the voice persisted, calling my name again and again, urging me to turn around, to follow it. It was familiar, eerily familiar, like it was mimicking my voice, distorted and twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. I quickened my pace, breaking into a full sprint when the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Ryan!" I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely keeping my balance as I raced toward what I thought was the direction of my car. But the forest was disorienting. Every tree looked the same, and the path seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. I was lost. Then up ahead I saw it, a small cabin nestled among the trees. I didn't remember seeing it on the way in. Panic and relief warred inside me. Part of me wanted to turn back and run, but I knew I had to check it out. Maybe someone inside could help. The cabin was old, its wood weathered and gray, the windows dark. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the rusted doorknob. Something about the place felt wrong, but I couldn't turn back now. I pushed the door open and it creaked ominously. Inside, the air was thick with dust. A single flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the room. The place was sparsely furnished, just a couch, a table, and an old cracked mirror on the wall. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The silence was suffocating. As I ventured further in, I spotted an old security camera set up in the corner of the room. It looked out of place, too modern for such a rundown cabin. There was a small monitor, and next to it several dusty VHS tapes. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the monitor, flicking it on. The screen came to life, showing various black and white feeds from cameras positioned around the cabin. One showed the front door, another the back, and several others inside the rooms. But something about the footage was off. The screens flickered, and the images were distorted. I sat down, scanning the feeds for anything unusual, and then I saw it. A figure. It was barely visible, standing near the back wall of one of the rooms. The image was grainy, but it was clear enough to make out the shape of a man. He stood completely still, facing the wall, not moving an inch. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. Who was he, and how long had he been there? I switched between the different cameras, but the man was only visible in that one room. And then, without warning, the feed cut out, leaving the screen in total darkness. Panic surged through me. I frantically tried to switch the monitor back on, but it wouldn't respond. The cabin felt colder now, the silence pressing in on me. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shone it around the room, but everything was as it had been, except for one thing. The door to the basement was slightly open, a faint light spilling out from the darkness below. My heart raced as I approached the door. I didn't want to go down there, but I had to know what was going on. Slowly, I descended the creaky wooden stairs, the smell of damp wood and mildew assaulting my senses. The basement was dimly lit, the walls lined with old shelves stacked with boxes and cobwebs. Then, in the far corner of the room, I saw him, the figure from the camera. He was standing perfectly still, facing the wall, his back to me. My breath caught in my throat as I raised the flashlight, the beam flickering slightly. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking, but the figure didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" I demanded, but still, there was no answer. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. His feet weren't touching the ground. He was hovering a few inches above the floor, his body unnaturally rigid. I stumbled back, fear gripping me. I had to get out of there. I turned and raced up the stairs, not daring to look back. The door to the cabin slammed shut behind me as I burst outside, gasping for air. The night was cold and still, the forest looming around me like a cage. I ran to my car, heart hammering in my chest, fumbling with the keys. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the road. But the road was empty. The cabin was gone. The next day, I sold the cabin at a rock-bottom price, packed my things, and left. I haven't gone back since. No one will believe me, but I don't care. I'm never setting foot in that place again. I've been a cop for almost 10 years now, and I've seen more than my fair share of weirdness on the job. Most of the time, it's just people being stupid, drunk, or high, but sometimes you get a call that stays with you. A call that makes you rethink everything you know about the world. This is one of those calls. It was a slow night, the kind of night where the boredom eats away at you, and you start hoping for something, anything, to happen. I was working the late shift, patrolling the outskirts of town with my partner Joe. We'd been riding in silence for most of the night. the only sounds being the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. We were just about to call it a night when the dispatcher's voice came over the radio. Unit 217, we have a 911 call of residents on Old Mill Road. Report of suspicious activity. The caller stated that someone was trying to break into their home. Please respond. Old Mill Road was in a pretty secluded part of town, mostly older homes that had been around for decades. It wasn't the kind of place where people usually caused trouble. I looked at Joe, who was already turning the car around. Finally, something to do, he muttered. As we drove toward the address, the houses became fewer and farther between, the streetlights more sparse. Old Mill Road was practically in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and farmland, the kind of place where it got pitch black at night, except for the faint glow of the moon. We pulled up to the house, a two-story, colonial-style place that looked like it had seen better days. The porch light was flickering, casting long shadows across the yard. The trees loomed tall and dark around the property, making the house seem even more isolated than it already was. I could feel that familiar tension building in my chest, the kind that comes with the unknown. Joe glanced at me as we stepped out of the car. "You ready for this?" he asked, a smirk on his face. "Yeah, let's just get it over with," I replied, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping over me. We approached the front door, which was slightly ajar. That was the first red flag. Joe knocked, but the door swung open at his touch. "Police! Anyone home?" he called out, his voice echoing into the house. No response. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it inside. The place was a mess. Furniture was overturned, papers were scattered everywhere, and there was a faint, acrid smell in the air, like something had been burning. "Looks like someone's been here," I said, stepping inside. "But where's the homeowner?" Joe followed me in, his hand on his gun. "I don't like this," he muttered. We moved through the house, checking each room. It was empty, no signs of a struggle, but signs of someone having been here recently. The kitchen table was set with plates, half-eaten food still on them, as if whoever had been here had left in a hurry. We reached the staircase that led to the second floor, and that's when we heard it. A low, creaking sound, like someone was walking around upstairs. Joe and I exchanged a glance. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low. We crept up the stairs, the old wood groaning under our weight. At the top of the landing, there were 3 doors. The creaking sound was coming from the door on the far left, which was slightly open. Joe signaled for me to take the lead, and I pushed the door open with the barrel of my gun. The room was empty, except for an old rocking chair in the corner, gently moving back and forth. The window was open, the curtains billowing slightly in the breeze, but no one was there. "What the hell?" Joe muttered, stepping into the room. That's when we heard the noise again, this time from downstairs. A loud crash, followed by the sound of footsteps. Heavy footsteps moving fast. Joe bolted for the stairs and I followed, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We reached the bottom, just in time to see a shadow dart into the kitchen. "Freeze!" Joe shouted, his voice booming through the house. No response. We moved into the kitchen, guns drawn, but whoever it was had disappeared. The back door was wide open, leading out into the yard. "Stay here," Joe said, motioning for me to check the house while he went outside. I stayed behind, quickly moving through the remaining rooms, but the place was empty. It didn't make any sense. Whoever had been in the house had vanished. I was about to head back to the kitchen when something caught my eye. In the corner of the living room, partially hidden behind a curtain, was a small door. It was old and worn, the kind of door you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. I opened it slowly, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the basement. The smell hit me immediately, stronger now, like something had been rotting down there for weeks. I called out for Joe, but he was still outside, probably checking the perimeter. I had to make a decision. My gut was telling me not to go down there, but I couldn't just leave it unchecked. I gripped my flashlight tighter and descended the stairs, the beam cutting through the darkness. The basement was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and the air was thick with that same acrid, burning smell. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, its dim glow barely illuminating the room. In the center of the basement was an old wooden table, covered in what looked like blackened photographs. I stepped closer, my heart racing. The photos were burnt, but I could still make out the faces in some of them. Children and families, all of them distorted by the fire. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room, motionless. My blood turned to ice. It was a man tall and thin, his back to me. He was wearing a tattered coat, and his head was slightly tilted as if listening for something. I raised my gun, my voice shaking. "Police, turn around slowly." He didn't move. I stepped closer, my gun trained on him. I said, "Turn around." He remained still, his back to me, like a statue frozen in time. Just as I was about to yell again, there was a sudden movement. The man turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the side of his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were black, completely black with no whites or pupils. I froze, unable to move or even think. The man smiled, a slow, eerie smile that sent a chill down my spine. And then, without warning, he lunged at me. I fired twice. The shots rang out in the small space, deafening in the silence. The man crumpled to the ground, unmoving. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Joe came rushing down the stairs, his face pale. "What the hell happened?" I could barely speak, my hands shaking as I pointed to the figure on the ground. But when Joe shined his flashlight over the body, I felt my stomach drop. The man was gone. All that remained was a pile of ash, smoldering faintly on the cold concrete floor. We didn't say anything as we left the house. Joe radioed for backup, and by the time they arrived, we had already made up a story about the intruder escaping through the woods. There was no way we were telling them the truth, not that anyone would believe us. A few weeks later, I heard that the house had been sold. The new owners had put it on the market for an absurdly low price, claiming they were moving out of state. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that man in the basement. I think about his black eyes and the way he just disappeared. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting in the darkness, watching. I never really believed in the whole haunted thing. I'm a pretty down-to-earth guy. No nonsense, just trying to make ends meet. I've been a traveling technician for years, and I've stayed in more motels than I can count. You get used to weird vibes in some of these places. Old buildings, strange smells, creaky floors, but it's all part of the job. That's why, when a coworker of mine, Rick, started telling me about this place called Evergreen Rest Inn, I just shrugged it off. Rick loved his ghost stories, and I figured this was just another one to add to the pile. But the name stuck in my head, and that's why, when I was driving through a small town after finishing a job late one night, and I saw the Evergreen Rest Inn on the side of the road, I couldn't help but be reminded of Rick's tale. It was late, I was dead tired, and I still had a couple of hours to go before I could make it home. The rain had started to come down in sheets, so I figured I might as well call it a night. It was one of those old, single-story motels you only see in movies, faded signs, peeling paint, and a few dim lights in the parking lot. I pulled in, parking my car near the office. The place looked like it hadn't seen a proper guest in years. The neon sign was half lit, and the office door had that old sticky sound when I pushed it open. The receptionist, an older guy with a stoic expression and thick glasses, barely acknowledged me. I signed in, paid for the room, and grabbed the key. He handed it to me without a word, and something about his blank stare was unsettling. My room was number 12, tucked away near the end of the lot. The door creaked loudly as I entered. The room smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning chemicals, but I'd stayed in worse. It was your typical cheap motel room, faded floral bedspread, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a tiny TV in the corner. It wasn't welcoming, but it would do for one night. I dropped my bag on the floor and flopped down on the bed, pulling out my phone. No signal. Figures. The rain was now pounding on the windows, and a strong wind rattled the glass. I thought about Rick's story again, about how some guests never made it out, how the staff was strange. Typical urban legend stuff. I chuckled to myself and decided to check the room. One habit I've developed over the years is checking every corner of a room before settling in, especially the bathroom. You'd be surprised at the things you find. Leaky faucets, broken doors, and sometimes even creepy crawlies hiding under the sink. As I walked toward the bathroom, I noticed a strange draft. The window was closed, so it didn't make sense. The bathroom was small and dingy, but serviceable. I checked the sink and the shower. Both seemed to be working fine. But just as I turned to leave, I noticed something odd. The mirror was fogging up. At first, I thought it was just the humidity from the rain outside, but it was fogging up as if someone had just taken a hot shower. I hadn't even turned on the water. That's when I heard a faint knock, but not from the door. It was coming from the wall. 3 soft taps, rhythmic and deliberate. I froze, staring at the mirror, watching the fog continue to spread across its surface. Another knock, louder this time, came from the wall directly opposite the bed. My heart started to race. I walked back to the main room and pressed my ear against the wall. There it was again, 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. I wasn't about to let a creepy old motel get in my head, so I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe the walls were just thin and I was hearing someone next door. I turned on the TV to drown out the noise and lay down, hoping to get some rest. But the knocking didn't stop. Every few minutes there it was again. Sometimes soft, sometimes loud, but always 3 knocks. I got up, turned the TV off, and stood in the middle of the room, listening. The knocks seemed to be coming from different walls now, and every time I moved closer to one side, they would stop, only to start again on another side. I walked back over to the window, peering out into the parking lot. My car was still the only one there. It didn't seem like anyone else was staying at the motel, and yet the knocking continued. I grabbed my phone again and noticed that the signal had returned, but just as quickly, it disappeared. I had 1 bar, enough to maybe call someone, but the moment I tried dialing out, the screen went black. The air in the room grew thick, almost suffocating, and I started to feel dizzy. That's when I noticed something else. The fog from the bathroom had now crept into the room. It was subtle, but the air had a faint mist to it, and the temperature had dropped sharply. The knocks grew louder, this time coming from the ceiling. I glanced up, expecting to see something, anything, but the ceiling was empty. Then came the scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor directly above me. But this was a 1-story motel. There was no upstairs. My chest tightened as I backed away from the center of the room. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. It was so thick you could feel it pressing in on your ears. And in that moment, I became painfully aware that I wasn't alone. A shuffling sound came from behind me. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around. The bathroom door had opened on its own. The light inside flickered for a moment and then died, plunging the room into darkness. For a long moment, I just stood there, not daring to breathe, waiting for something to happen. The air felt charged with static, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Then, from the bathroom, I heard a low, guttural whisper. It wasn't a voice, not really, but more like a raspy breath scraping through the darkness. That was it. I grabbed my bag, stumbled toward the door, and threw it open, not caring about the rain or anything else. I rushed to my car, slamming the door behind me and turning the engine over. As I sped out of the lot, I glanced back at the Evergreen Rest Inn. For a split second, I saw a figure standing in the window of my room. I didn't look back again. The next morning, I called Rick to tell him what happened. He just laughed it off, calling it a practical joke. But I knew something had been in that room with me. Something that didn't want me to leave. A week later, I passed through the same town again. The Evergreen Rest Inn was gone. The lot was empty, as if it had never been there at all. It was around midnight when I first pulled into the parking lot of Ralph's Diner. The neon sign, flickering faintly, read "Open 24 hours," casting an eerie glow over the deserted lot. I was on a long drive, heading back to the city after visiting my parents, and hunger had gotten the best of me. It was the only place open for miles, and I hadn't seen another car or building for what felt like hours. I parked my car and stepped out into the cold night. The wind howled faintly, sending a chill through my body, and the air felt oddly heavy. Something about the place felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. But it was late, I was exhausted, and I needed food. I shrugged off the unease and walked toward the door. Inside, the diner looked like it had been frozen in time. The red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and chrome accents screamed 1950s nostalgia. The place was empty, except for a waitress standing behind the counter, her back to me. She had an old-fashioned uniform on, complete with a frilly apron. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and grease. As I sat down at the counter, the waitress slowly turned around. Her face looked off. Her expression was frozen in a strange smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her skin was pale, almost too pale, and her eyes were wide, staring just a little too intently at me. She didn't say a word, just handed me a laminated menu, her smile never wavering. The menu was small, offering only a few options: a burger, fries, and a couple of breakfast items. Everything about it seemed strange, like it hadn't been updated in decades. But again, I brushed it off, chalking it up to the diner's old-fashioned theme. "I'll just have a burger and fries," I said, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The waitress didn't respond. She just nodded and shuffled back into the kitchen, disappearing behind the swinging door. As I waited, I looked around. The place was unnervingly quiet. There was no music playing, no hum of conversation, no clattering dishes, just silence. The only sound was the faint buzz of the neon sign outside. After what felt like forever, the waitress reappeared, sliding the plate in front of me. The burger looked wrong. The meat was almost gray, and the fries were limp and greasy like they had been sitting under a heat lamp for hours. My stomach churned, but I was too tired and hungry to care. I took a bite. The taste was off. It was bland, almost tasteless, but there was something else, an odd metallic aftertaste that lingered on my tongue. I forced myself to swallow, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at the back of my mind. As I ate, I noticed something strange. The clock on the wall above the counter, it wasn't moving. The hands were stuck at 12:05, even though I had been there for at least 20 minutes. I stared at it for a while, my heart beginning to race. Something was seriously wrong with this place. I looked around again, and that's when I noticed something even more unsettling. In the far corner of the diner, in one of the booths, there was a man. I hadn't noticed him when I came in, and he hadn't made a sound. He was sitting perfectly still, his head down, staring at his plate. I couldn't see his face, but there was something about the way he was sitting, so rigid and motionless, that made my skin crawl. "Hey," I called out, hoping for some human interaction to shake off the growing fear. But he didn't respond. He didn't even move. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor in the dead silence. "Are you okay?" Still nothing. I approached the booth slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I realized something horrifying. The man wasn't breathing. His skin was pale and waxy, and his eyes were wide open, staring blankly at his plate. He was dead, and judging by the state of his body, he had been dead for a long time. I stumbled back, my heart racing as panic set in. I turned toward the waitress, my mind scrambling for an explanation, but she was just standing there, that same unnerving smile plastered on her face, her eyes unblinking. "What is this?" I stammered, backing away. "What's going on here?" She didn't answer. She just kept smiling, her eyes locked onto mine. I bolted for the door, my heart thudding in my chest. But when I pushed it open, I froze. The parking lot, the road, and everything outside the diner was gone. Instead of asphalt and distant headlights, there was only darkness, a thick, impenetrable blackness that seemed to swallow everything beyond the diner's walls. I could feel it pressing in, suffocating, like the diner was floating in some void of nothingness. I stepped back, my mind racing. How had I gotten here? Where was the road? My car? I turned around and sprinted back toward the counter. I had to get answers, had to figure out what was happening. But when I got there, the diner was different. The walls seemed to stretch further, the lighting dimmer, more oppressive. And the dead man in the booth? He was gone. The booth was empty, as if he had never been there. The waitress still stood behind the counter, her grin wider now, unnatural, like her face was stuck in a grotesque mask of glee. The air was thick and stifling. I could feel my chest tightening, panic clawing at my throat. "Please," I begged, "what's happening here?" She tilted her head slightly, her smile never fading. "You ordered the special," she said, her voice cold, hollow, "but no one ever leaves." I stumbled back, my mind spinning. I didn't know what to do or where to go. I ran toward the kitchen, hoping to find some way out, some exit that wasn't swallowed by the void. But the moment I pushed through the swinging doors, I realized my mistake. The kitchen was a nightmare. The walls were covered in rust-colored stains, and the floor was slick with something dark and sticky. But what made my stomach turn was the meat, piles of it, raw and rotting, strewn across the counters. And among the cuts of flesh, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A human hand, severed at the wrist, lying on the chopping block. I gagged, stumbling back into the diner, my vision swimming with fear. I had to get out. I had to escape. But every time I turned around, the diner seemed to shift, the walls closing in, trapping me. And then I heard it, the scraping of chairs, the shuffling of feet. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw them. The man from the booth and others, figures pale and lifeless, rising from their seats, their dead eyes locked on me. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran. The diner was no longer a diner. It was a maze, twisting and turning in impossible ways. Every time I thought I'd found the exit, I was back where I started, the dead figures closing in on me. Finally, I made it to the door. I threw it open, bracing myself for the void, but instead, I was back outside. The parking lot, the road, it was all there, just as it had been when I arrived. I didn't question it. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, and sped out of the lot, my tires screeching against the asphalt. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached the next town. To this day, I don't know what happened at Ralph's Diner. I've tried looking it up, but there's no record of it anywhere. No mention of its existence. It's as if the place never existed. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. I'm just glad I made it out. When I bought my first home, I couldn't have been more excited. It was a charming 2-story house nestled in a quiet neighborhood, a far cry from the cramped apartment I had been renting. After years of saving, the place felt like a dream come true, a sanctuary away from the chaos of the city. As a recent graduate, I was looking forward to the peace and solitude the new home promised. Little did I know, it was also a place where my worst nightmares would come to life. It was a chilly October evening when I moved in, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. I spent the entire day unpacking boxes, relishing the feeling of my belongings finally being in a space that was my own. By the time night fell, I was exhausted but thrilled. I poured myself a cup of coffee, settling down in my new living room, a warm glow from the lamp illuminating the cozy space. As I sat back, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the neighborhood was. Not a sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was almost too quiet. I shook off the feeling, telling myself that it was just the charm of suburban life. I finished my coffee and decided to head to bed, looking forward to the sleep that awaited me after the long day. After all, something was soothing about being alone in my own home. I locked the front door and turned off the lights, making my way upstairs. My new bed was inviting, and within minutes I was fast asleep. Hours later, I awoke suddenly, my heart racing. I could swear I had heard a noise coming from downstairs. It was a soft thump, almost like someone had knocked something over. I lay still, straining to listen. Silence filled the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to dismiss it as the creaks and groans of an old house settling. After a few minutes of tossing and turning, I finally managed to drift back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up late, sunlight streaming through the window. I shrugged off the strange noise from the night before, attributing it to my overactive imagination. After getting ready for work, I made my way to the kitchen to brew some coffee. As I stood waiting for the pot to finish, I noticed something unusual. The kitchen window was slightly ajar, even though I was certain I had closed it the night before. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed it aside, blaming it on my exhaustion. That day at work, I found it hard to concentrate. My mind kept wandering back to the window. Had I left it open, or was it a sign of something more sinister? I tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered in the back of my mind. When I returned home that evening, the sun was setting, casting eerie shadows across the rooms. I felt a strange sense of unease wash over me. The house felt different now, like it was holding its breath. I shook it off again and went about my evening routine. After a quick dinner, I decided to watch a movie to distract myself. As I settled down on the couch, the movie playing softly in the background, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a paranoia that crept in slowly, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I glanced around the room, the darkness looming in the corners, and my heart began to race. I turned up the volume, trying to drown out the anxiety building inside me. Halfway through the film, I heard it again, a soft thump, this time coming from upstairs. I jumped, the sound echoing through the silence of the house. My heart raced as I paused the movie, straining to listen. It was followed by another thump, then silence. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt frozen in place. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, forcing my legs to move as I climbed the stairs. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight, each sound amplifying my anxiety. I reached the top and stood in the hallway, peering into the darkness. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to check the bathroom first, the one place where my mind felt there could be someone hiding. I pushed the door open, half expecting to find something lurking inside. It was empty, and I sighed in relief. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting past the door frame. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No answer came, just silence. I swallowed hard, my instincts screaming at me to run back downstairs, but curiosity held me in place. I moved slowly toward the source of the movement, but as I turned the corner, I found nothing, just the dark hallway stretching out before me. I was about to retreat downstairs when I noticed something strange. The door to the guest bedroom was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it earlier. Cautiously, I pushed it open further, peering inside. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, and I felt an inexplicable chill run through me. The room was empty. I stepped inside, feeling a strange energy in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. I turned to leave when I spotted something on the floor. A small, folded piece of paper. My heart raced as I picked it up, unfolding it with trembling hands. "I'm watching you." The words sent a wave of ice through my veins. I dropped the note as if it had burned me, stumbling back into the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the walls closing in on me. I turned and fled downstairs, locking the door behind me and bolting the windows. I felt sick with fear, my mind racing as I tried to process what was happening. I grabbed my phone and called my friend Sarah, my voice shaking as I recounted the events of the night. "You need to come over. I think someone is in my house," I said, fighting back tears. She agreed to come over right away, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. While I waited, I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows. My heart raced as I heard every creak and groan of the house. I knew I was being paranoid, but it felt so real. The fear seeped into every corner of my mind. When Sarah arrived, I practically threw open the door, relief flooding through me. "Thank God you're here," I said, pulling her inside and locking the door behind us. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm terrified." She looked concerned as I led her to the living room, my mind still racing. I explained everything, the noises, the notes, the feeling of being watched. "You're just getting settled in," she said, trying to comfort me. "You're probably just overwhelmed." But as we sat together on the couch, the feeling of dread returned. I couldn't shake the image of the note from my mind. The air felt thick with tension, and every time a shadow flickered, I jumped. We decided to watch a movie to distract ourselves, but I could barely focus. As the night wore on, I kept checking the time, wishing the hours would pass faster. I wanted to feel safe again, but the unease hung heavily in the air. It was well past midnight when Sarah finally decided to head home. "Are you sure you'll be okay?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "Yeah, I'll be fine," I replied, forcing a smile. But inside I felt anything but fine. After she left, I locked the door behind her, every click of the lock echoing in the silence. I was exhausted, but sleep felt like an impossible task. I curled up on the couch, watching the flickering light from the television as I fought to stay awake. Just as I started to doze off, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a thump coming from upstairs. My heart stopped. I sat up, straining to listen. It was closer this time, almost like footsteps. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I called 911. "There's someone in my house," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. The operator assured me they were sending someone right away, but as I hung up, fear consumed me. I knew I had to get out of the house. I took a deep breath, steeling myself as I crept toward the front door. Just as I reached for the handle, the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from the upstairs hallway. My heart raced as I felt my blood run cold. I turned to run, but the door swung open, and there stood a tall, shadowy figure. "Let me in," a low voice croaked, sending chills down my spine. I stumbled back, fear clawing at my throat. "Please," the voice begged, the figure stepping closer. "I just want to talk." I shook my head, backing away as the figure continued to approach. "Who are you?" I cried out, my voice trembling. The figure paused, the dim light revealing a face hidden in shadow. "I'm a friend," it said, a sickening smile spreading across its face. "I've been watching you for so long." Panic surged through me as I turned to run, the figure lunging forward. I dashed into the kitchen, my heart racing as I scrambled for a weapon. A knife, anything. I grabbed a butcher knife from the block, my hands trembling as I faced the door. "Please don't," the figure shouted, voice rising in panic. "I'm not here to hurt you." But I couldn't take any chances. I swung the knife, ready to defend myself, as the figure stepped into the kitchen, the light revealing a man with wild hair and a crazed look in his eyes. "I just wanted to see you," he cried, arms raised as if to prove he meant no harm. But the sight of him only fueled my fear. I backed away, ready to strike. Just then I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens outside. Relief flooded through me, but the man's face twisted in anger. "You called the cops," he yelled, advancing on me. I raised the knife, heart pounding as I prepared for the worst. But before he could reach me, the front door burst open, and officers flooded into the room. "Hands in the air," one shouted, gun drawn. The man froze, eyes wide as he looked from me to the officers. "Please, I wasn't going to hurt her," he pleaded, but the officers quickly moved in, apprehending him. I stood there, shaking as they cuffed him and led him away. The officer turned to me, concern in his eyes. "Are you okay?" I nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. I thought he was going to kill me. As they escorted the man out of my house, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The nightmare was finally over. I was safe. In the days that followed, I learned more about the man who had invaded my home. He had been stalking me for months, watching my every move. But thanks to the quick response of the police, he was now behind bars. The experience shook me to my core, but it also taught me the importance of being vigilant. I invested in a security system for my home, ensuring that I would never feel that vulnerable again. Months later, as I settled back into my routine, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the safety of my own home. But now I was prepared. I had taken back control of my life, and I wasn't going to let fear dictate my future. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend getaway. After a grueling semester of classes and exams, I needed a break from the city's chaos. My friends and I had rented a small beach house on the coast, a quaint little place just a stone's throw from the water. The plan was simple: sun, surf, and a whole lot of relaxation. But sometimes the ocean has other plans. As we arrived at the beach house, excitement bubbled in the air. The salty breeze was refreshing, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filled our ears. We unloaded our bags, the sound of laughter and chatter filling the space as we settled in. The house was charming, decorated with beachy decor and large windows that offered stunning views of the ocean. After unpacking, we decided to hit the beach. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The water shimmered, inviting us to dive in. We raced each other to the waves, shrieking with delight as the cool water enveloped us. It felt incredible to be free, to let go of the stress, and just enjoy the moment. As the sun began to set, we gathered around a small fire pit we had set up on the beach. We roasted marshmallows, sharing stories and making memories. But as the stars began to twinkle above us, an unsettling feeling crept in. The atmosphere shifted, and I couldn't help but glance toward the darkened ocean. "Anyone else feels like the waves are a bit off?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. "You're just imagining things," Sarah, one of my friends, replied, playfully nudging me. "The ocean is just being dramatic." I chuckled, but deep down I felt an unease I couldn't shake. The waves seemed to churn more violently, and the horizon appeared darker than it should have. It was as if something lurked beneath the surface, hidden and waiting. That night, we decided to call it an early night. Exhausted from our day of sun and fun, we crawled into our respective beds, lulled to sleep by the sound of the waves crashing outside. But sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned, the feeling of dread gnawing at me. It was almost as if the ocean was calling to me, whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. Around midnight, I woke up to a loud crash outside. My heart raced as I shot up in bed, listening intently. The waves were roaring, and I could swear I heard something else, something unnatural. I got out of bed, tiptoeing to the window and peering outside. The moonlight cast an eerie glow on the beach, illuminating the sand and surf. But it was what I saw that made my blood run cold. There, standing at the edge of the water, was a figure, a tall, slender silhouette, unmoving, facing the ocean. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but the figure remained. My heart pounded in my chest as fear washed over me. "Guys!" I whispered, shaking Sarah awake. "There's someone outside." She groaned, rubbing her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "Look," I said, pointing toward the window. As she turned, the figure had vanished. The beach was empty, just the waves crashing against the shore. Sarah frowned, clearly still half asleep. "You're just seeing things. Go back to bed." I hesitated, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. I crept back to bed, pulling the covers tight around me, trying to shake off the chill that had settled in my bones. The next morning, I brushed off my fears, attributing them to exhaustion. We spent the day swimming, building sandcastles, and soaking up the sun. The beach felt lively, filled with laughter and joy. But as the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. That night, we decided to have a bonfire on the beach. As the flames danced, we shared ghost stories, each tale more chilling than the last. But my mind kept drifting back to the figure I had seen. I didn't want to ruin the fun, so I kept my thoughts to myself. As the fire crackled, the ocean seemed to call to us. It was a strange melodic sound, almost like whispers carried by the wind. The tide was unusually high that night, the waves crashing closer to our feet. I glanced out at the water, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw that figure again, standing just beyond the reach of the light. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, noticing my distracted demeanor. "You've been quiet." "Yeah, just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. But I could see the worry in her eyes. Later, as we packed up for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we should leave. Something was wrong with this place, and I felt it in my gut. But the others laughed it off, too caught up in their fun to notice my apprehension. As we retreated to the house, I took a last look at the beach. The waves churned violently, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something about the way the water crashed against the shore, a darkness lurking just beneath the surface. I shuddered, closing the door behind me and locking it tight. That night, I lay awake in bed, the sound of the waves echoing in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The thought sent chills down my spine. I finally fell into a restless sleep, but it didn't last long. I was jolted awake again, the sound of banging reverberating through the house. My heart raced as I sat up, listening intently. It was coming from outside, a rhythmic pounding against the side of the house. Fear gripped me, and I crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. What I saw made my heart drop. The figure was back, but this time it was closer. It was standing right by the water's edge, its long, thin limbs contorted unnaturally. Its face was shrouded in shadows, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness, locking onto me. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. "Guys, wake up!" I shouted, my voice trembling. I rushed to the others' rooms, shaking them awake. "There's someone outside! We need to go." "What? Are you serious?" Jake groaned, rubbing his eyes. "It's probably just a beachgoer." "No, I saw a figure." "It's right outside," I insisted, my heart racing. Reluctantly, they followed me to the living room, still half asleep. I led them to the window, but as we looked outside, the figure was gone. The beach was quiet, the moonlight casting a serene glow on the water. "See? You're just imagining things," Sarah said, yawning. "No, I swear I saw it," I replied, feeling frustrated and scared. "Something is wrong here." "Maybe you should lay off the caffeine," Jake joked, trying to lighten the mood. But his laughter faded when he noticed my pale face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I shook my head, the dread building inside me. "I'm serious, I don't want to stay here anymore." The others exchanged glances, and I could see their uncertainty. "We can't just leave now," Sarah said, her voice laced with annoyance. "We've only been here for a couple of days. It's probably nothing." I wanted to argue, but part of me knew they were right. I was tired and on edge, and maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. The next day, we decided to explore the nearby town to take our minds off things. The sun was shining, and for a moment, I felt a sense of normalcy return. We wandered through shops, picked up souvenirs, and enjoyed ice cream by the pier. But even amidst the laughter, I could feel the weight of unease in the back of my mind. That night, we returned to the beach house, the sun setting behind us. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, but as the sun disappeared, an unsettling darkness settled over the ocean. We gathered around the fire pit again, determined to enjoy our last night. As the flames flickered, I glanced at the water, the sound of the waves almost hypnotic. But then I saw it again, a figure standing just beyond the surf, barely visible in the dark. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was seeing things, but the figure remained. "Do you guys see that?" I asked, pointing toward the water. Everyone turned to look, but the figure was gone. "See what?" Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. "Nothing," I said, feeling defeated. I tried to shake off the dread that settled in my stomach, but it clung to me like a shadow. Later that night, as we sat around the fire, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. I glanced toward the water again, and to my horror, I saw the figure standing closer now, right at the edge of the waves. It was more defined this time, the outline unmistakable. "Guys, I think we need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "That thing is out there." "What thing?" Sarah asked, annoyance creeping back into her tone. "You're just being paranoid." "No, I'm serious," I insisted, pointing toward the ocean. "It's right there." They all turned to look, and once again the figure had vanished. "See, nothing there," Jake said, shaking his head. I felt a mix of frustration and fear. "You don't understand. I can feel it. Something's wrong with this place." As we sat there, the atmosphere shifted again. The waves crashed more violently, and the wind howled through the air. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced toward the water one last time. This time, the figure was right there, its face twisted and distorted, staring directly at me. "Guys, I'm not joking," I yelled, my voice filled with panic. "We need to go." At that moment, the fire flickered violently, and the wind picked up, sending embers flying into the air. The group looked at me, uncertain, but finally understanding the urgency in my voice. "Okay, fine," Sarah said. "Let's pack our things." We hurried inside, adrenaline pumping through our veins as we gathered our belongings. My heart raced as I thought about what was lurking outside, the figure waiting for us in the dark. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see it watching us. "Is everyone ready?" Jake asked, shoving his clothes into his bag. "Almost," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just need to grab my phone." As I turned to grab it, a loud bang echoed from outside, shaking the house. I froze, terror coursing through me. It sounded like something had slammed against the door. "What was that?" I whispered, my heart racing. "Probably just the wind," Sarah said, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the tremor in her voice. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself she was right. But as I looked out the window again, I saw the figure standing right by the house, its eyes glowing eerily in the darkness. I stumbled back, fear clawing at my throat. "It's here! It's right outside!" I screamed. Panic erupted as we rushed to the door, trying to find a way out. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking as I struggled to get it open. But as I finally turned the knob, the door swung open violently, and I was met with the sight of the figure standing just inches away from me. I screamed, stumbling back as it lunged forward, its distorted face twisting into a horrific grin. But before it could reach me, Jake slammed the door shut, locking it tight. "What the hell was that?" he yelled, his face pale. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, my heart racing. "It's not safe." We raced through the house, searching for another exit, but the windows were locked tight, and the only way out was through the front door. I could hear the figure pounding against the door, its movements frantic and violent. "Help! Someone help us!" Sarah shouted, her voice filled with terror. But there was no one around. We were completely isolated, trapped in this nightmare. "Think, we need to find a way out," Jake yelled, his panic rising. In a desperate attempt, I grabbed a chair and threw it against the window. It shattered, glass flying everywhere as I climbed through the opening. "Come on," I urged, holding my hand out for the others. One by one, they climbed through the window, and as soon as we were outside, we took off running toward the beach. The sand felt cold beneath my feet as we sprinted, not daring to look back. But just as we reached the water's edge, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. I turned, and there it was, the figure standing at the edge of the shore, illuminated by the moonlight. It was closer now, its face twisted and contorted in a horrific smile, as if it was enjoying our fear. "Run!" I screamed, plunging into the water. The coldness enveloped me, but I didn't stop. I swam as hard as I could, urging my friends to follow me. I glanced back, and to my horror, I saw the figure wading into the water, moving effortlessly despite the waves crashing around it. "Keep going," I shouted, adrenaline coursing through my veins. "We can't stop." We swam further into the ocean, the water growing darker around us. I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I realized the figure was still pursuing us, its movements swift and fluid. Just as I thought we might be able to escape, a hand reached out from the darkness, grabbing my ankle. I screamed, kicking and flailing, but it was too strong. It pulled me under, dragging me into the depths of the ocean. I fought with everything I had, but the water closed in around me, pulling me deeper. I could see the figure above me, its distorted face grinning as I struggled to break free. The world around me grew darker, and just as I thought I was going to drown, I felt a surge of strength. I broke free, kicking upward with all my might. I burst through the surface, gasping for air, but the figure was still there, lurking just beneath the waves. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse. Suddenly, I felt hands gripping my shoulders, pulling me back toward the shore. It was Jake. "I got you!" "Swim!" he yelled, urging me to kick harder. Together, we fought against the waves, struggling to reach the safety of the sand. As we finally reached the shore, we collapsed onto the beach, gasping for air. But the nightmare wasn't over. The figure emerged from the water, its long limbs dripping with seaweed and salt water. It stood on the shore, watching us with that same twisted grin. "What the hell is that thing?" Sarah cried, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I shouted, scrambling to my feet. "We need to get away." We ran along the beach, the figure following us, its movements eerie and unnatural. I could feel its presence behind us, a dark shadow looming in the night. Just when I thought we couldn't run anymore, we spotted a small boat docked a short distance away. "There!" Jake shouted, pointing toward it. We raced toward the boat, and as we reached it, I fumbled with the engine, my hands shaking. Come on, I pleaded, desperately trying to start it. But just as I got it running, I heard a chilling laugh echoing behind us. I turned, and there it was, the figure standing just a few feet away, its eyes glowing in the darkness. "Get in, go!" I yelled, pushing my friends into the boat. I revved the engine, and with one last glance back at the shore, we sped away into the open water. The figure stood on the beach, watching us as we disappeared into the darkness. I could still feel its gaze on me, haunting me even as we put distance between us. We spent the night on the boat, terrified and shaken. The ocean felt vast and empty, but at least we were safe, for now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking just beneath the surface. Eventually dawn broke, and the first rays of sunlight illuminated the water around us. I could see the shoreline in the distance, and relief flooded through me. We had survived, but I knew I would never return to that beach again. As we made our way back to the shore, I glanced back one last time. The ocean shimmered in the morning light, but I could still sense the darkness lurking beneath. I vowed to never forget the terror we faced that night, a reminder that sometimes the ocean holds secrets best left undiscovered.